You can all hear me. I'm having some issues with my audio. Welcome to the weekly episode of the Practical SQL Server HA DR show. Um, I started looking at themes for different months so that it's kind of easy to follow along. This month's theme is all about backups, and what's interesting is because despite working with storage media for the past 70 years, I was looking at some articles from uh, I think it was one of the backup uh, companies or backup storage companies that dates working with digital storage media back in the 50s, 1950s. So 70 plus years later, we're still using digital storage or storage media, and then we're storing data on storage media. 70 plus years later, we have been taking backups. Cloud, with all the talks around the cloud taking over the job of people who are responsible for taking backups, uh, meant that they're now going to be responsible for that. But despite all conversations around the evolution of storage, I mean, I remember the time when it was all like tape, zip drives, iOmega. For those of you who remember those iOmega drives, those big ones, punch cards, the way we store media or data, uh, magnetic tapes. When I was working as a data center engineer, we had like tapes for backups. Part of our disaster recovery strategy is put the data backups on tape, ship the tape over to a remote site for us to store it there. Sometimes, if need be, we will ship the storage media over to a different country because that's where our data center is. And so, with all of these evolutions, we're still taking backups. But the thing about this is, uh, especially with the technology and the risks associated with new technology, like for instance, I wrote in the description about ransomware. We're taking backups. We store our backups off to a removable media. But the thing is, even those become victim of ransomware. The story behind why I started looking at backups this month and focusing on the topic of backups this month is, again, we have been doing this for decades, yet we are still facing the same challenges. We are still addressing the same issues that we've had from way back when we started using magnetic tapes or any type of storage media. I was looking at some of the conversations I had on email with a client where they were attacked by ransomware to a point where not only are their databases um, ended up being corrupt, but worse, even their backups end up being corrupt. And that's why I want to talk about this. The three common mistakes that IT pros make when working with backups. Like I said, you kind of wonder, we've been doing this for more than almost a century now. Almost. We've been doing this for almost a century now. We should have learned a thing or two about backups, yet we're still having issues about data corruption, data loss, and disaster recovery, which means even with the evolution of technology, it's not enough for us to really focus on what the technology can provide, but rather looking at backups in a grand scheme of things. And that's why I want to talk about the common mistakes that IT pros, and I'm not just referring to IT pros, sysadmins, or DBAs. I'm referring to anybody who is responsible for disaster recovery, right? The thing about disaster recovery and the thing about backups is this: it's kind of like a set and forget thing, that when you set it and you you think it's working fine, but then in the long run you kind of forget that it was there in the first place, right? And the challenge with this is, when something works really, really, really well, it becomes uh, something that you, I don't want to say ignore, but it's at the back of your mind. You know it's there, it works, and you trust it until it doesn't work. I couldn't count the number of times where I had to work with a customer who either has to deal with data corruption, pretty common as data corruption, um, and then they realized that the backups that they have been taking for months are not workable, meaning it doesn't work. right? And that's why I want to talk about these 3 common mistakes, because whenever I have to deal with disaster recovery or data recovery in general, these are the 3 most common things that I have been seeing when it comes to working with backups. And I want to zoom in specifically into SQL Server because, for one, this is a Practical SQL Server HA show. I want to zoom in specifically to in the SQL Server realm, but this is applicable to just about anything enterprise-wide when it comes to doing backup. So get your pen and paper ready, write this thing down. These are the 3 common mistakes that tech people in general, whether you're a sysadmin taking care of the servers or you happen to be the storage admin who's now responsible for taking the backups, or you're a dedicated backup admin for a very large enterprise. Um, um, I know with the different roles and with the move to the cloud, the job of the backup admin slowly evolved to a point where, okay, we don't need a backup admin anymore. Everything's going to the cloud. And that's why I said, I've seen these mistakes that a lot of people are making, and that's why I kind of see the pattern, because when you start looking at different approaches, you also want to see whether or not those approaches work. And that's why I've seen these things. Number one, again, get your pen and I'm old school. I still use pen and paper. First one. First mistake is not being clear on recovery point, recovery time objectives, and service level agreements. What do I mean by that? I'll use SQL Server as an example, but you can use enterprise backups for your servers. We create a backup strategy. Like, okay, if it's a VM, we'll take a VM snapshot every day. And then we say, okay, we have a snapshot of the VM as if it was working properly at 8 p.m. every single day, right? We create those strategies, those backup strategies, without being very, very clear about what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And it's something that I have been emphasizing on even before. Well, like I said earlier, um, even with storage media being around for more than 70 plus years, we're still addressing the same issues and we're still facing the same challenges, mainly because number one, every backup that you ask, I don't want to say every backup, majority of the backups that are being taken are simply being taken without clear understanding of what your recovery point, recovery time objectives, and their service level agreements. And you can always go back to all of these, right? And I'm not just talking about backups here, because this also applies to high availability solutions like availability groups or failover clustering or uh, stretch clustering or load balancing. It applies to both HA and DR, in this case, specifically to backups. Go ask a VM admin who is taking daily VM snapshots and ask the person, what is the recovery point objective and recovery time objective for this specific VM? Again, for databases, it's different because we're now looking at data. But if it's an application, let's say for instance, it's a web server, and somebody's simply taking snapshots of the VM, it's fine because you don't actually change the application that often. So the recovery point objective might not be relevant, right? You're not changing applications every day. If you are, there's something wrong, right? You're not changing applications every day, but data changes every day. So you now have to be very clear about what it is that you are trying to accomplish. Recovery point objective. If you're taking VM snapshots every 8 p.m., does that mean your recovery point is 24 hours, meaning you're okay with potentially losing data for an entire 24-hour window? Not to mention, are you okay with, let's say, we're going to recover the database and the only available backup is from a database VM snapshot? Are you okay with being able to restore the database after the VM has been restored, and if the data is not consistent after that recovery time? Apply backups. Will you be able to restore everything within 24 hours? And this is, like I said, very common. I've looked at, excuse me, excuse me, I've looked at database maintenance plans where backups are configured. Uh, I've looked at enterprise backups where they're using agents, for instance, third-party backup tools that will use SQL Server backup agents. And it's fine that you have something. It's fine that you have at least either a VM snapshot or a database backup from an agent taking that backup. But unless you're clear about what it is that you're trying to accomplish, and from a DR, or disaster recovery point of view, what's your recovery point, recovery time objective, and what's your SLA, then you're just doing it for the sake of doing it. And that you have to start with that first. That is the starting point. You got to be very clear. And interestingly, though, even when people will start implementing stuff like we want to use our enterprise backup solution. I'm using, let's say, for instance, you're using third party like Veeam for your VM snapshots, or BackupExec, or any type of enterprise backup like System Center. I forgot what the tool is, but the thing is, even if you're using third-party backups to do your backups enterprise-wide, you got to be very clear. And just because you've standardized it, and I talk about standardization as well, where you are applying blanket rules across either database servers, application servers, VMs, physical machines all across the enterprise, doesn't mean that everything has to apply to everything. What do I mean by that? Like I said, I would see applications being backed up every day using VM snapshots because, again, applications don't change that often every single day. Unfortunately, though, because the company would sometimes standardize on taking VM snapshots every day and using VM snapshots even for their databases, they assume that everything else becomes part of that backup, which, again, clearly, when you start to look into the details of it, unless you're very clear about what your recovery point, recovery time objectives are, you're going to treat everything the same. And this is also one of the reasons why I'm not in favor, and I got my own opinions, but I'm not in favor of doing third-party backups who don't support SQL Server native backup APIs. Because I've seen it happen so many times when a third-party backup utility would actually cause more issues to the database, meaning it would cause corruption because how they did it. Like, for instance, quiescing the storage, which means freezing the storage, and therefore SQL Server, because it's being locked. And I use the analogy of, two kids, right? Somebody, one kid has a balloon, and then another kid starts grabbing that balloon, and whoever pulls first becomes the winner. Well, actually, no, because the balloon ends up becoming, it ends up breaking. Same thing. Your databases are locked by a service, in this case, SQL Server, and your database files are being locked by the SQL Server service or the SQL Server process, and up comes the backup agent. If it doesn't support the native SQL Server backup APIs, what ends up happening is it takes a lock on the file, quiesces it, freezes it, starts grabbing the file because they want to take backup. Next thing you know, and again, in this case, no kid is stronger than the other. They're equally strong as far as locking the file, grabbing access to the file, pulling the file from both ends. That's why a lot of backup utilities are actually causing corruption because of this. And a lot of changes, or a lot of approaches and strategies have been created where you shut down SQL Server, you take the backup, and then you restart SQL Server. A lot of these things are being done without really understanding, well, wait a second, before you even implement a strategy, go back to what we're trying to accomplish. What's your recovery point? What's your recovery time objective, right? How much data can you afford to lose? How much data or how much time is allowed for you to be down, right? And it's not the responsibility of the IT pro or the sysadmin or the DBA to describe or define this. It's the responsibility of the business to define this. However, it is the responsibility of the person in charge of it to ask those questions, because you're the one responsible for it. Most of the time, you'll hear people talk about, I want zero downtime and zero data loss. But the thing is, well, that zero downtime and zero data loss thing is unrealistic unless you tag a bunch of zeros to your how much, whatever you're willing to pay for, right? Because the closer you are to zero downtime and zero data loss, the higher the more expensive it becomes. So I spent a lot of time on knowing what the goal is, because at the end of the day, your backups are useless if they're not meeting those objectives, right? So that's the first one. Not being clear on recovery point, recovery time objectives, as well as SLAs for whatever database or whatever server they're trying to back up. Okay, that's the first one. The second one is this: picking and choosing a backup solution based on two things: price and ease of use. Price and ease of use. Remember what I mentioned earlier. If you want zero downtime and zero data loss, you got to get as close as possible to many zeros in your bank account if you want to pay for zero downtime and zero data loss. Because there's a cost associated with it. More often than not, people want a backup solution that's free or open source, or anything that we can get for cheap, or anything that comes out of the box. There's nothing wrong with that, but if that becomes the basis of how you choose your backup solution, right? If that becomes the basis of how you decide which third-party backup solution you're going to implement, or if you are going to just use the native tools available, then you also need to make sure that whatever you choose meets, going back to number one, meets your recovery point, recovery time objectives, and SLAs. And I did say two main deciding factors, right? Price and ease of use, right? Price and ease of use. Now, I have to blame Microsoft for this? No, I don't want to blame Microsoft for this, because otherwise they're not going to create better products. But when you start to think about the ease of use, Microsoft started this whole journey about using a very nice, intuitive, graphical user interface, right? And this makes it kind of like part of the deciding factor when choosing a third-party product, or when choosing a backup solution. Oh, we have a backup solution and it's command line only. We don't have a UI. I don't think it's a good idea because nobody from our team knows how to use it. Now, it can be fine to start choosing backup solutions or third-party backup solutions based on price and or ease of use, because those are part of the costs that you need to take into account, right? If you're implementing a backup solution and nobody knows how to use it, restore it, then why even have it in the first place, right? It's just like having a spare tire and you don't even know how to put it on your car. Although I had my car for that long and I have not had the opportunity to use it ever. It's still brand new, but which means I don't know how to do it because I haven't done it before. So a lot of the times when people choose backup solutions or third-party backup solutions, they would look for these two things: price, and it's driven by the price. The reason why they want to do that is because, again, it's kind of like a set and forget thing. You mean I'm paying for something and it's really not doing anything? The same thing applies to, like, insurance coverage, for instance. You want something that's cheap, bare minimum. Well, you also have to think about what is covered in your policy, right? Because backups are kind of like an insurance policy. You don't really feel like you need it until you actually need it. I heard so much stories about people from Florida who had certain coverage in their home insurance policies. They were saying, okay, I chose the cheapest one, and then when a hurricane hits and they ask for uh, uh, funds for repair, their insurance companies, oh, we didn't cover that because that's kind of like what you paid for, right? So instead of looking at price and ease of use, go back to the first thing, that I mentioned. Go back to focusing on recovery point and recovery time objective, and use that as a basis. Okay, use that as a basis for making decisions. The good thing about this is when you buy a SQL Server license, there's a native function to do backups using SQL Server native backups, and it comes out of the box. You're technically getting it for free, right? Again, because most companies would make decisions based on, okay, we ease of use. I'm not a DBA, but I'm taking care of backups. I'll just use this third party so that I'll do it for all of the servers. I'll take care of the backups for the domain controller, the mail servers now go to the cloud. I'll take care of the backups for the app server, and the database server, because I don't know how to use SQL Server. I'm not a DBA. So I'll just use this, I'll standardize it, and then I'll implement the same backup solution for everything, right? Biggest mistake, because again, if you are a sysadmin taking care of the backups and you're simply relying on a third-party solution to do that, and then you have, or even so, you have not tested, okay, you have not tested your recovery, your backups, and do a recovery. How sure are you that it would actually work? In the same way that I can say, hey, I have a spare tire in my car. I've never done it ever with my car. I don't know if I can, unless I would try replace one of my tires. At least I know when something happens, I have the capability to do it. In the same way, which leads me to the third thing, actually, which leads me to the third common mistake, is that most people would set up a backup strategy, not a restore strategy. Okay. I tell my customers a lot, I don't believe in backups, but that doesn't mean you're not supposed to be taking backups. I tell my customers that I don't believe in backups because, for one, you're not taking backups just for the mere fun of it. You're taking backups because you need to be able to restore your backups. And just like what I mentioned earlier, what good are your backups if you cannot restore them? Whenever I get into a new customer environment and I have to somehow come up with a new deployment, I would, excuse me, first thing that I'll do is I'll set up a full database backup and log backups every hour. If they have not told me yet what the recovery point and recovery time objectives are, okay, I will have something at least. And then after I've set it up, I would ask questions, going back to number one, I would ask questions about what are our recovery point and recovery time objectives, and have that in writing, because that will be the basis of how you would then make sure that your backups actually work. And number two, that restoring your backups will actually meet the recovery point and recovery time objectives, right? There are several instances, and I have worked on several cases in the past where, yeah, the backups worked 5 years ago, right? Back when the database was less than 500 gigs. They were more focused on speeding up the backup process. And you would see this even in the questions on forums and news groups like Stack Exchange, all of these online communities. They would ask the questions. My backup used to take 1 hour. And we're talking about, large databases. My backup takes 1 hour, now it's taking 2 hours. How can I optimize my backup? And some people would start responding with, you implement, like, for instance, SQL Server, the thread size, you parallelize your backup. Almost everybody is giving suggestions on how to improve backups. And sure, you may be able to bring down your backups from, let's say, 2 hours to 1 hour, spread database backup, because the database is growing large, right? Fun fact, increasing data is actually a sign of growth in the business. So the data is growing, the database is growing. You kind of expect that your database backups are also growing. And so you may be able to optimize your backup to a point where, and again, you can throw in a bunch of recommendations, use 7,200 RPM for your backups because, well, it's not mission critical, but then it's no longer enough. Use 10,000 RPM disks. They're still cheaper and there's still backups. Use solid state drives so you can improve your backups. However, people recommend the way to improve the backup process, none of those would contribute to the restore process until you start testing them. That's why the third biggest mistake that I've seen so much is having a backup strategy but not having a restore strategy, right? Similar to the second one where you're picking a third-party solution or using native tools to do your backups. They have to meet your recovery point and recovery time objectives. Same thing, the backup strategy and the restore strategy is something that has to meet the recovery point and recovery time objectives. I'm using an example that I've seen small and medium-sized companies use. Enterprise backups are being utilized. They would take snapshots or they would take backups using agent, store it on a network storage device, put it on tape. Well and good, it works, right? Until of course they have to restore. Because for one, how long will it take? Let's take a step back. Let's say you have a requirement to take that tape or to take that backup device onto a remote location, maybe store it on a storage facility with lock and security. If you were to restore that backup from tape or from that storage device from the remote storage facility, how long is it going to take for you to go to the remote storage facility or for somebody else to go to the remote storage facility, take out the tape? Oh, and by the way, be authorized to take out the tape or the storage media from the storage facility, drive back to the data center, load the storage device into the whatever backup device reader that you load it up, unload the tape or unload the backup, and then restore it. How long is that going to take? Because if you're simply looking at, it takes an hour to take the backups and we're done, you're not including the time it takes for you. And we're looking at worst case scenario because the worst case scenario should be the one that you need to plan for when it comes to disaster recovery, right? How long is that going to take? And when you do that, is it going to meet your recovery point and recovery time objective? The one, and this was an eye opener for me when I started implementing stuff like, okay, let's do a 15-minute log backup regularly, okay? Because we want a recovery point and recovery time objective of 15 minutes. We'll take a full database backup every day. Let's say 12 midnight, we'll take a full database backup every day. And then we'll take log backups every 15 minutes. We're covered, right? Anybody who says that has probably not had the opportunity to restore all backups. That's 24, let's say 24 times 4, 96 or 95. One full database backup plus 95 other transaction log backups. Because that's the worst case scenario. Worst case is what happens if your database goes down at 11:57. 11:57. Sure, you'll be saying, well, we got 11:40 backups, log backups from 11:45. I'm covered, right? Well, you may have data protection, meaning RPO might have been achieved, but what about RTO? The amount of time it takes for you to restore one full database backup and 95 other transaction log backups. I highly recommend that you try it out just for once and see whether or not it really does meet your recovery objectives. I've seen cases where it took half a day, even with a powerful server with all flash storage and tons of RAM and all of these things, because they optimized on the backup but not on the restore, right? Optimizing on the backup but not the restore is simply just giving yourself a cop out because, well, backups actually work. In fact, it's also one of those things where if you're using the SQL Server management or database maintenance plans, and then you're looking at the job that does the backup, if it says backup successful, most of the time we ignore the successful backups. In fact, one of the things that the community suggested that let's remove, or back then it was a trace flag that you can apply to SQL Server where you can ignore all successful backups completed messages that are being written to the SQL Server error log. Nothing wrong with that, but it also creates that false sense of security because, for one, you kind of think, okay, backups are fine, right? Backups are fine until you restore them. Okay, so that's why you really need to have a restore strategy in place, and not just restore strategy, a restore strategy that you reevaluate on a regular basis. On a regular basis. Why? Again, your data is growing. Your 500 gigabyte database 5 years ago could be a 2 terabyte database today, or a 4 terabyte database today. If you're restoring from backup, of course, a 500 gigabyte is not going to take as much time as a database that's 4 terabyte size in space. Not to mention all the processes involved. If that's on an enterprise storage and that has been taken, the media has been taken off-site, you have to go there, physically take the storage device, put it on your reader, all that. Does that still meet your recovery time objective? Okay. That's why I'm huge on not backup strategy, but a restore strategy that is evaluated on a regular basis, not one time set and forget thing, but on a regular basis, right? So those are the three common mistakes that people working in tech make when it comes to backups, despite the fact that we've been working with storage media for the past 70 years. They're still the same old mistakes because, again, for one, well, it's easy to do. We take backups and that's it. Until a disaster happens, right? So those three things, not being clear on what the ultimate goal is or what the real goal is, meaning not being clear on your defining the recovery point objective, recovery time objectives, and SLAs, right? Number two is picking backup utilities or backup tools from third-party vendors or even the native ones like the SQL Server native backups based on price and ease of use, right? Price and ease of use. SQL Server DBAs are very comfortable using the native backup utility, but what if the person taking care of the SQL Server databases isn't well versed in SQL Server and he has other responsibilities to take care of? So the first thing that comes to mind is, we'll use third party. I'll use it all over because it's the only thing I know, right? And not the third one is focusing more on a backup strategy instead of a restore strategy that meets the ultimate goal, right? So what's the key takeaway here? The key takeaway is, number one, even if you're not clear yet on what the recovery point or recovery objectives are, start asking. It's not your responsibility to define these. It's your responsibility to start asking questions for what the business decides as far as those goals are concerned. Number two, start creating a restore strategy to make sure that they actually meet those recovery objectives. And make sure, third one is, you test your backups by restoring. Literally, test your backups by restoring. That way you know whether or not it works. Not to mention, testing whether or not your process actually works. Because part of that, remember what I mentioned earlier, going to the remote storage facility, grabbing the tape, that is part of your restore process. If nobody else has access to the keys to go to the storage remote storage facility, then are you going to wait until that person comes back? Of course not, right? You need to test your restore strategies so that you know. If somebody asks, oh, we tested it and it works, right? Old as it may seem, these are still the common things that, common mistakes that people make, to a point where, again, when somebody restores from backup, recognizes that the backups don't work, and then they're screwed. Or worst case, instead of losing 1 hour worth of data, they lost 4 days worth of data, right? That's about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. Tune in again next week or next time for another topic. And again, for the topic of this month is focused more on the backups, sharing with you some of the insights and learnings that I've seen both in my customers' environments, as well as the typical patterns in order for you to prevent them from happening, or because the reality is disasters will happen. It's a matter of being prepared when those unexpected disasters really do happen, right? And if you need any help, for instance, evaluating whether or not your backup strategies actually work, or let me rephrase that, restore strategies actually work, whether or not you're implementing a third-party solution, looking at how it fits into your overall restore strategy, or just evaluating your entire infrastructure, whether or not you're meeting your goals, let's have that conversation. Use the link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. Let's talk. I'm happy to help in any way I can. And if I'll be able to help you, I will. If not, I will steer you in the direction that would help serve you best. So again, use that link on the screen. Schedule a strategy session. By the way, this would lead you to my booking page where you can pick a time that works for you. And I look forward to having that chat with you. All right. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Enjoy whatever it is that you plan on doing today. And I look forward to having you again next time.